A racist cop handcuffed a black woman unjustly, purely out of prejudice, but what he didn't know, was that the woman he just humiliated in front of an entire precinct parking lot, was his new boss. And what she did next left everyone in complete shock. It was supposed to be her first day. No uniform yet, no introduction had been made. She arrived early, pulled her car into the reserved spot marked for command staff, stepped out, straightened her blazer, and prepared herself to walk into a new chapter of her life, one she had fought so hard to earn. She had no idea that before even stepping inside the building, she'd be reminded in the most brutal, humiliating way that some people would always see her as a threat, not because of her actions, not because of her words, but because of her skin. Because before she even reached the front steps of the precinct, she found herself pinned against the hood of her own vehicle, handcuffed, searched, accused, reduced. "You can't park here, ma'am," the officer barked, not even trying to hide the disgust in his voice. "This is for staff. Unless you're lost, or lying." She turned calmly, trying to explain. But he was already reaching for her wrist. "I said, hands where I can see them. Don't play smart. I've seen your type before." "My type?" she whispered, stunned. "Yeah. The kind that thinks a nice suit and a fake smile can get you past security. Not today." The scene unfolded in seconds. No chance to speak. No badge presented. No question asked. Just cold metal against her skin, the eyes of onlookers, the flash of a phone recording, and the slow, burning realization that she wasn't being treated as a professional, as a colleague, or even as a human being, but as a criminal. He paraded her across the lot, chest puffed, like he'd just caught someone in the act. She didn't resist. Not physically. But the fury in her eyes screamed louder than any protest ever could. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she knew this moment would mean something more. It had to. "Look at her face," he scoffed to a younger officer as they passed. Already rehearsing her little discrimination speech. Save it. Nobody's buying it. But someone would. Eventually, everyone would. The tension inside the precinct shattered when the captain came running out, wide-eyed, screaming for him to release her. Confusion turned to silence. Silence to panic. Panic to realization. But the damage was done. His grip on the cuffs loosened, but not before shame flooded his face. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had dragged his own career by the neck into the fire. Because this woman, the one he assumed didn't belong, was the one now holding the keys to his future. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She looked him in the eyes, in front of the entire staff, and said, "Thank you. You just gave me everything I needed to make sure no one here ever goes through what I just did." This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It was prejudice, raw and unchecked. It was years of entitlement, packed into one moment of blind arrogance. And now, the man who lived by the badge would be forced to face the weight of his own actions, under the direct command of the woman he tried to disgrace. The whispers started almost immediately. Officers unsure where to stand. Some embarrassed. Some exposed. Some finally realizing how fragile their so-called superiority really was. But what she did next wasn't fueled by revenge. No, that would have been easy. She wanted justice. She wanted truth. She wanted change that echoed through every hallway, every roll call, every single locker room in that building. What followed wasn't just a power shift. It was a reckoning. Files were reopened. Complaints long buried were dusted off. Patterns were exposed. And while some clung to silence, others found their voice for the first time, because her presence alone reminded them that justice wasn't just a word painted on the wall, it was a promise, now walking among them in heels and authority. But the real question isn't what she did in that first week. Or even that first month. The real question is, what did she do to him? Because for a man so certain of his place in the chain of command, so comfortable in his role as judge and enforcer, to suddenly find himself answering to the very person he disrespected, feared, and underestimated. What does that do to a man's ego? To his future? To his name? And more importantly, what did she discover about him that would change everything? Stay with us. Because what happens next will not only shake that precinct, but might just shake you. Before we begin today's story, we want to speak directly to our black viewers. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. We believe in justice, dignity, and the power of truth. If you've ever felt silenced, judged, or mistreated because of the color of your skin, this story is for you. You matter. Your voice matters. And your story matters. Enjoy this powerful story. And if you believe in narratives that challenge injustice and uplift resilience, make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist and hit that like button. Now, here's your story. The city of Baltimore had never been kind to people who looked like Imani Turner. Not when she was a child riding the bus to school and being watched more closely than the boys who actually caused trouble. Not when she was the only black cadet in her police academy class who graduated top of her year but was told she'd have to earn the same respect her white peers were given on day one. And certainly not when, after nearly 2 decades of spotless service, decorated fieldwork, and a master's degree in public safety leadership, she was appointed deputy chief of a precinct where almost no one looked like her, and even fewer believed she belonged. Imani was a woman of quiet fire. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She had mastered the art of commanding presence without raising her voice. Her posture alone, straight, steady, no wasted movement, told people she wasn't here for games. And still, even after everything she had achieved, even after building a career on integrity, community, and intelligence, she knew there were people waiting to see her fall. Not because she wasn't qualified, but because the badge didn't erase centuries of perception. She knew the room would watch her walk in and measure her by skin before they measured her by resume. But she also knew how to use that to her advantage. Let them underestimate her. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Because while they were busy doubting her, she was already 10 steps ahead. She moved to Baltimore from Charlotte when she was just 13, after her mother, a public school teacher, transferred to teach in underserved communities. Her mother was strong, principled, and endlessly patient, even when the job broke her spirit a little more each year. Imani had watched her mother work long hours, sometimes unpaid, fighting not just for her students' education but for their dignity. That quiet sacrifice stuck with her. When her brother got caught in a police raid at a friend's house, wrong place, wrong time, no charges ever filed, Imani understood what power, misused, could do to someone's life. And from that day on, she promised herself that she would become part of the system only to change it from the inside. Her rise in law enforcement wasn't smooth. It was paved with skepticism, double standards, and daily microaggressions dressed up as protocol. But she kept her head down and her performance sharp. Every arrest report she filed, every community event she organized, every promotion she earned, they all added up to something bigger. Not just a career. A movement. A mission. And now, standing outside the front entrance of the Northern District Precinct on a gray, humid Monday morning, she was about to walk into the most challenging role of her life. Not because of the work itself, but because of the people inside. The building had history. You could feel it in the worn tiles underfoot and the faded plaques on the walls. This wasn't a precinct known for progressiveness. It was the kind of place where certain rules were never written down but strictly enforced. Where locker room banter blurred the lines of decency, and newcomers were judged on everything but merit. And at the center of that environment stood Officer Cole Radford. Radford was a man who had stopped evolving somewhere around 1999. A mid-40s white officer with a reputation for being old school, he had served 20 years without ever receiving a formal complaint, largely because his partners knew better than to report him, and his victims rarely had the means to speak up. He believed in discipline, control, and the natural order of things. He believed policing was about dominance, not dialogue. And above all, he believed respect should be given to those who demanded it, not those who earned it. To many of his colleagues, Radford was a reliable officer. He handled situations with authority, he didn't fold under pressure, and he got results. But there was an undertone to the way he operated. A sharpness to his stare when dealing with black civilians. A dismissiveness in his voice when speaking to female officers. He rarely used slurs, but his implications were loud. He'd look at a suspect and say things like, "figures," or "one of those," and no one would challenge him. Because challenging him meant creating waves. And in that building, waves got you blackballed. Imani had read the internal files before accepting her new post. She knew who Radford was. She knew about the quiet settlements the department paid out when his interactions went too far. She knew the leadership had kept him on for his years of service, his connections, and his loyalty to a culture that desperately needed dismantling. And yet, she had not planned on making him her first target. Her goal was transformation, not retribution. At least, that was the plan. But fate, or ego, had other ideas. That morning, she arrived early, parking in the staff-designated lot behind the building. No one was outside. She stepped out of her sleek black sedan, the sun just beginning to burn through the Baltimore haze, and adjusted her blazer. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement as she made her way toward the side entrance, where she was scheduled to meet the captain before introductions. She didn't wear a uniform that day, a deliberate choice to make a statement of transition, of evolution, of leadership that wasn't bound to appearance. She was halfway across the lot when the voice called out behind her. "Excuse me. Ma'am. You can't park here." She turned, calmly. "I'm with the department," she said simply. Radford didn't even blink. "I didn't ask if you knew someone here," he said, walking toward her, hand already resting on the butt of his belt. "I said, you can't park here. Staff only. I am staff. And I'm the Queen of England," he said with a smirk, pulling out his cuffs. She raised her eyebrows, not in fear, but in disbelief. "You're making a mistake." He scoffed. "Yeah, I've heard that line before. Don't worry, sweetheart, we'll clear it up inside." That was the moment. The one that would echo through every corridor of that building for weeks. As she stood there, being restrained by a man who hadn't even asked for her name, she realized something vital: respect here wouldn't be given, it would have to be taken. Not with force, but with truth. With exposure. With clarity. Because nothing exposes a man like his own arrogance. By the time the captain came running outside, shouting for Radford to unhand her, the entire scene had already unfolded. Phones had recorded it. Junior officers had witnessed it. And Radford's face shifted from smugness to pure dread. Imani didn't say a word. She didn't lash out. She didn't even pull away. She let the cuffs sit on her wrists a moment longer, let the silence swallow the parking lot whole, and then, only then, did she meet his eyes and say, with chilling calm, "You just introduced yourself to your new commanding officer." That moment, brief as it was, shattered the entire power dynamic of the precinct. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because the real challenge wasn't the humiliation. It was deciding what to do with it. How to turn it into something bigger than personal vengeance. How to make sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to the next woman. Or the next black officer. Or the next kid just walking down the street. The fallout would take time. It would be messy. And it would reveal things about that department, and about Radford himself, that no one was ready to face. But Imani had waited her whole life to be in this room. And now, she was going to change everything. Starting with him. The air inside the precinct was heavier than usual. It wasn't just the humidity from the early Baltimore summer or the old ventilation system that barely worked, it was something else. A shift. An undercurrent. Something had cracked the usual rhythm of the place. Officers whispered more than they talked. Doors that once remained wide open now creaked shut halfway. There was tension in the hallways, not the explosive kind, but the silent, crawling kind that lived in glances and unfinished sentences. And at the center of it all walked Imani Turner, with measured steps and unshakable focus, the sound of her heels cutting clean through the discomfort like a metronome ticking toward change. Her first week as deputy chief was watched closely, not because people were excited to see what she would bring, but because many were waiting for her to prove them right, to stumble, to overreach, to push too hard or not enough. Some called it curiosity. Others, behind closed doors, called it containment. They believed she would temper herself, play it safe, keep her head down like many before her. But Imani had no interest in becoming another silent placeholder for progress. She had come prepared, not for a fight, but for a transformation. And she knew transformation always began with resistance. She started with observation. For the first few days, she didn't change any protocols, didn't issue bold directives. Instead, she watched. She walked the floors, joined briefings, attended roll calls, and took notes. She noticed who made eye contact and who didn't. Who shifted uncomfortably when she entered a room and who seemed relieved. She paid attention to who controlled the conversations, who interrupted, who stayed quiet. It was in those silences that she found the most revealing truths. Power didn't always show itself in rank, sometimes it hid in habit, in language, in the subtle way some people claimed space while others were constantly shrinking to make room. Then came her first one-on-one with Officer Cole Radford. Scheduled. Formal. Necessary. He walked into her office with a smirk already forming, the kind that made it clear he thought he was doing her a favor by showing up. He sat before she invited him to. Legs wide, arms slung over the chair, posture radiating defiance. "So," he said, stretching the word like it carried no weight, "we gonna talk about our little misunderstanding, or?" Imani didn't respond immediately. She let the silence expand, watched him shift slightly in his seat. Then she leaned forward just enough to make him pay attention. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, voice steady. "You made an assumption. You acted on it. And in doing so, you violated policy, procedure, and basic human decency." He snorted. "I made a judgment call. Lady wandering around the back lot, no ID, no uniform, no visible credentials. You know how it is, had to be sure." She didn't blink. "What you did wasn't a judgment call. It was profiling. And if that's how you treat potential colleagues, I don't want to imagine how you treat civilians." He scoffed again, but the edges of his smirk were fading. "Listen," he said, straightening up, "I've been here a long time. I know this department inside and out. People trust me. I get results. You want to fix morale? Go ahead. But don't make an example out of me just to make a statement." Imani stood slowly. Her gaze never left his. "I don't need to make an example out of you, Officer Radford. You already did that all by yourself." He didn't answer. He just stood, nodded once with a tight jaw, and walked out. Word of that meeting spread fast. No one knew the exact exchange, but everyone could feel the aftershock. Radford's usual cocky strut was replaced by something tighter, more calculated. He kept to himself more. Still loud in the locker room, still dominant in briefings, but there was a shift. Attention. A man trying to hold on to power he could feel slipping. Meanwhile, Imani moved forward. She didn't storm the system. She dissected it. Quietly reopened old case files that had been marked closed with little explanation. Reached out to community liaisons. Asked questions no one had dared ask before. Officers who once rolled their eyes during diversity trainings now found themselves under review for past complaints. Suddenly, what had once been whispers in the break room became a low roar: change wasn't coming. Change was here. And for some, that was terrifying. She met privately with junior officers. The ones who avoided eye contact during meetings, who kept their heads down. Many of them women. Several of them black. One by one, they told her the same thing, about being ignored, being second-guessed, being undermined during field operations. About knowing better than to speak up. About surviving, not thriving. One young officer, tears in her eyes, said softly, "You're the first person I've seen here who looks like me and doesn't apologize for it." Imani carried those words like a stone in her chest. Not because they hurt, but because they reminded her why she came. And with every new story, every quiet revelation, her resolve deepened. But Radford was not done. He began to push back, subtly at first. Filed countermemos. Disputed her decisions in meetings. Threw around phrases like department morale and field experience to discredit her reforms. He leaned on his alliances with certain captains, tried to reroute decisions through back channels. There were rumors he was collecting support to file a grievance. But more than anything, he clung to one belief, that she didn't have anything solid on him. That despite what happened in the parking lot, she had no real leverage. That he could outlast her. That people like him always outlasted people like her. What he didn't know, was that she had been watching longer than he realized. She had already gathered logs of his traffic stops. Analyzed body cam inconsistencies. Interviewed former ride-along partners who remembered just enough to raise red flags. Patterns were forming. Not just about misconduct, but about intention. A career built on unchecked authority was beginning to show cracks. And with every piece of data, every quiet testimony, every uncomfortable truth pulled from the shadows, she got closer to something undeniable. Her final step before launching formal action was a review of internal complaints. Some were vague. Others suspiciously short. But one file stood out. Dated 5 years prior. A civilian complaint that had been filed and buried within a week. The complainant? A black teenage boy stopped for, looking suspicious, outside a convenience store. The report had no footage, no witness statement, just a brief summary claiming uncooperative behavior. But the boy's name was there. So Imani searched. What she found didn't just connect a dot. It lit a fuse. The boy had been hospitalized later that night for a broken wrist and a concussion. No charges were filed. No follow-up interview was conducted. His mother had tried to reach someone in the department. Her emails went unanswered. Her calls never returned. Imani's hands trembled slightly as she closed the file. She stood slowly, walked to her office window, and stared out at the lot where everything had started. Something was coming. Not because she wanted revenge. But because the truth had finally gathered enough weight to tip the scale. And when it tipped, the impact would be seismic. The fluorescent lights in the precinct's internal affairs conference room buzzed faintly, the only sound filling the silence that had settled over the table. Thick folders sat in front of every person seated there, officers, administrative reps, one legal advisor, and at the head of the table, Imani. Her posture was calm, but her eyes had the sharp focus of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, not for hours or days, but for years. Her fingers remained still over the case summary. The others, however, shifted in their seats, stealing quick glances at each other, uncertain whether they were witnesses to a disciplinary review or the beginning of something much larger. The room had been carefully chosen. Not her office, not a conference room on the main floor where distractions could sneak in. This was deliberate. Confidential. Formal. And most importantly, unavoidable. Radford sat across from her, arms crossed, eyes glazed with irritation rather than fear. He had walked in with the same confidence he always wore, but it had started to fade as soon as he saw the volume of documentation in front of each participant. He scanned the faces, searching for someone, anyone, who might be on his side. What he didn't know was that each person at that table had read the reports. And most had already started to shift their perception, whether they admitted it or not. Imani began not with an accusation, but with a timeline. No dramatics. No raising of the voice. Just facts, precise and cold, laid out in sequence. A record of field stops going back 8 years, cross-referenced with civilian demographics. She pointed to a pattern of disproportionate targeting, subtle, but impossible to dismiss. She then moved to complaint histories. Not just formal ones, but internal memos, partner notes, even one-off comments from community outreach sessions that never made it into any official report. It built slowly, brick by brick, a case not only of misconduct, but of character. Still, Radford leaned back and smirked. "You're digging through dust, Chief. People complain all the time. Doesn't mean anything unless something stuck." Imani didn't look up from her papers. "That's the point. Nothing ever stuck. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen." He scoffed again. "You think you're gonna bury me with hearsay? After 20 years? Good luck." Now she looked up, and when she did, the smirk finally wavered. "I don't need hearsay, Officer Radford. I have evidence." She nodded to her assistant, who hit play on a small audio device resting on the table. A recorded statement began to play, a woman's voice, calm but deeply strained with emotion. It was the mother of the boy Radford had injured years ago. The one whose file she had found buried under vague language and absent follow-up. The woman described the night her son came home with a wrist bent unnaturally, his face swollen, his pride shattered. She spoke about the phone calls she made, the emails unanswered, the shame in her son's eyes when he said the officer who hurt him never even told him why he was being stopped. Her voice trembled when she said, "I told my son not to fight, to be respectful, to do everything right. But it didn't matter. It still wasn't enough." The room fell into complete silence as the audio ended. Radford's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He didn't speak. Imani's voice came low, steady. His name was Marcus Whitlow. 17. Honors student. No priors. And he hasn't set foot inside a school since. "That's not on me," Radford snapped. "He was acting suspicious, she cut in, her tone sharpening just slightly. "He was waiting for a ride. In front of a store. Wearing headphones. And your own partner admitted in his statement that you escalated the situation before even approaching." Radford sat straighter, but his posture was less defiant now, more defensive. "You're trying to rewrite history based on one-sided stories." "This isn't one-sided," she replied. "It's systemic. And you're not just part of it, Radford, you're a pattern. And for the first time, the pattern's being documented." One of the captains spoke, cautiously. "Imani, this is serious. We'll need to verify the footage, statements, corroborate." She turned to him, her voice unwavering. "It already has been. I wouldn't bring it here if it hadn't." Radford leaned forward suddenly, voice louder than before, eyes narrowed. "You think this makes you powerful? You think because they put you in that seat, you get to decide who deserves to wear the badge?" She didn't move. "I don't need to decide. Your actions already did." The room was quiet again. This time, the silence carried weight. Even those who might have previously backed Radford were still. They knew the department had protected people like him for years, some out of fear, some out of habit. But the tide was changing. And this wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about culture, accountability, and a line that had finally been drawn. Imani stood and gathered the files in front of her. "I'm placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the internal review. You are not to enter this precinct unless summoned for testimony. You are to surrender your weapon and badge by end of day." Radford's face turned red. He stood abruptly, fists clenched. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand what you're doing." She walked around the table slowly, stopping just inches from him. "No, Officer Radford. For the first time in a long time, someone understands exactly what's been going on." He didn't respond. He turned, jaw tight, and walked out of the room. But the story didn't end there. As the door clicked shut behind him, Imani turned to the room, voice softer now, but no less commanding. "This department is under review. Effective immediately, we'll be auditing all use of force incidents for the past 5 years. Every civilian complaint will be reopened and reevaluated. And we will no longer dismiss patterns as coincidence. If anyone here has a problem with that, my door is open." No one spoke. No one moved. But in that silence, something profound settled in the walls. A shift. Real this time. As Imani returned to her seat, she took a deep breath. Not out of exhaustion, but out of preparation. Because the review wasn't just going to shake the department. It was going to burn the rod out completely. And there was one more discovery, one final document she hadn't yet shared with anyone. Something buried even deeper. Something about Radford. Something that would change everything. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the precinct was unlike anything anyone had experienced before. Whispers carried down the hallways like smoke, thick with uncertainty and quiet dread. Some officers avoided eye contact altogether, while others, the ones who had quietly hoped for a shift in culture, seemed to walk a little straighter. The impact of Radford's suspension hadn't settled into routine just yet, it still felt like a raw nerve exposed in the center of the building. Imani entered through the front doors, her badge clipped clearly to her blazer, and made her way toward her office with a calm that felt unnatural to some. But underneath that stillness was a storm she had prepared her whole life to weather. Her assistant met her at the doorway, file in hand, eyes wide with the weight of what they had uncovered. Imani knew that look. It was the look of someone holding something that could change the direction of everything: confirmation, evidence, truth no longer buried under bureaucracy or silence. The file had arrived late the night before, compiled after cross-checking Radford's incident logs with civilian complaints flagged for missing audio or video. One name had come up again. Marcus Whitlow. But this time, alongside that name, was another. One that had never made it into the official reports. A witness. A fellow officer on the scene that night. One who had never spoken, never been interviewed, and had since left the force quietly under a medical retirement. His statement had been discovered through a legal archive request, an appeal tied to a personal civil suit unrelated to the case, but his deposition was there, and in it, he described what happened in the alley behind the convenience store. Not suspicion. Not resistance. Not even hesitation. Just a boy, standing still, before being slammed against a wall by an officer who didn't say a word. Imani sat with the file open before her, each word sinking deeper into her stomach. She reread the statement twice, 3 times, as if daring herself to believe it. Then she picked up the phone. By noon, she was standing in front of the captain, the legal advisor, and the department's HR investigator, laying out the final case. Not just for misconduct, not just for abuse of authority, but for criminal assault and falsification of reports. This wasn't just a matter of department ethics anymore. This was about justice. And as she spoke, her voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper with each breath, each detail laid down like a stone on the table. The captain, older and weary, sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply nodded when she finished and said, "It's time." That evening, Imani requested that Radford return to the precinct for a final administrative hearing. He walked through the doors just after 6, shoulders squared, face blank, but tension sat under his skin like electricity ready to spark. He was met by 2 internal affairs officers and escorted to the same room where the first review had taken place. This time, the table held fewer folders, but heavier consequences. Imani waited for him, alone. No one else. Just her and the man who had once thrown handcuffs on her like she was an intruder. As he stepped inside, he paused, eyeing the room suspiciously before taking a seat across from her. His silence wasn't confidence this time, it was calculation. He knew something had shifted. He just didn't know how far it had gone. "I've cooperated," he said first, his voice flat. "I've stayed quiet, followed your process, even when it was bulls." She held up her hand, calmly. "This isn't a negotiation. This is closure." He scoffed again, but it was hollow. "You're dragging up stuff from years ago. From a time when no one cared, not even the brass. You think it makes a difference now?" She leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "I don't care what they cared about then. I care what the truth is now. And I've got the witness statement to prove you lied on that report. That you used unnecessary force on a teenager who never even raised his hands. And you know what's worse? You walked away from it like nothing happened." His expression cracked, just slightly, and for the first time since they'd met, Imani saw something different in his eyes, not guilt, not remorse, but fear. "That file was sealed," he muttered. Imani didn't blink. "Not anymore." Radford stood abruptly, voice raised. "This is a hit job. You think I'm the only one who's done things like that in this building? You think I'm the only one who had to make fast calls in the field? You think I'm the villain here?" "You made yourself the villain," she replied coldly. "Every time you decided someone's value based on their skin, every time you wrote a report to protect yourself instead of the people you swore to serve, every time you silenced a voice so yours could stay loud. That's not pressure. That's abuse." He clenched his fists, but he didn't strike. He knew he couldn't. Not anymore. The power he once believed was untouchable was unraveling in front of him, piece by piece, word by word. "Where's this going?" he asked finally, quieter now. "What's your endgame?" Imani stood slowly, picked up a folder from the desk, and placed it in front of him. "This is a summary of the charges being filed. Your badge has been permanently revoked. You're being referred to the state's attorney for criminal review. The department will no longer shield you." He stared at the folder, unmoving. She waited a moment, then added softly, "You had every opportunity to grow. To change. To do right by the people who trusted you with their lives. But instead, you chose power over justice. And now, you answer for it." There was no more shouting. No desperate plea. Just silence. Heavy and final. Radford reached into his coat, pulled out his badge slowly, and placed it on the table without a word. For the first time, he didn't have anything left to say. No arrogance. No threats. Just resignation. Imani watched him go. Watched the door close behind him like a chapter being sealed shut. But she didn't smile. Not yet. Because justice, real justice, wasn't about moments of victory. It was about the ripple effect. The lives touched. The voices that could finally be heard. And the systems that would never go back to what they were before. That night, she sat in her office long after the precinct had emptied out. Outside, the streetlights flickered against the pavement. Inside, the quiet was peaceful, not because the work was done, but because the worst part was over. A knock came at the door. Her assistant entered, holding a sealed envelope. "This just came in," she said. Imani took it, opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from Marcus Whitlow. Now 22. A student again, finally back in school. He had heard about the investigation. And he had written to thank her. She read the words carefully, tears gathering without falling. "I never thought anyone would believe me," he had written. "But you did. And because of that, I believe in me again." She closed the letter, placed it on her desk, and leaned back in her chair. This was why she came. This was why she stayed. And this was only the beginning. The days that followed Cole Radford's formal dismissal were quiet in all the wrong ways. Not silent, the precinct was still alive with activity, arrests still happened, officers still clocked in and out, paperwork still moved across desks, but beneath it all was a current of discomfort, as if the entire structure was adjusting to a new shape, unsure of how to carry its own weight now that one of its heaviest pillars had been removed. There were no open celebrations, no visible signs of relief, but there was something unmistakable in the air, a collective holding of breath, the awareness that something foundational had shifted and that no one could unsee what had been exposed. Imani walked those halls with the same steady rhythm, but she could feel it, the glances that lingered a little longer, not with suspicion anymore, but with quiet acknowledgement. For some, it was admiration. For others, it was fear. And for a few, it was resentment blooming in silence. The department's administrative board had already begun discussions on deeper reforms. Her investigations had triggered automatic reviews of conduct patterns, forced the reopening of dozens of archived files, and initiated retraining protocols focused on implicit bias and procedural justice. It wasn't change for headlines. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind that didn't come with applause but demanded consistency. Imani knew that the hardest part wouldn't be removing someone like Radford. It would be what came after. Because systems don't crumble when one brick is pulled. They crack when people inside begin to question how those bricks were laid in the first place. Late one afternoon, she received an email marked with priority status from the Office of the Inspector General. They had begun their own external review, following the department's decision to formally refer Radford's case to the state. Attached were preliminary reports, not just about him, but about other cases that had similar red flags. Names she recognized. Officers still working. Cases that had passed her desk before without raising alarm, but now under new scrutiny seemed impossible to ignore. It was a sobering reminder that Radford hadn't operated in isolation. He had thrived in an environment that enabled him, protected him, and at times, silently applauded him. One name stood out in the file, Sergeant Timothy Wells. A veteran officer, decorated, publicly respectable. But behind closed doors, his record bore the same quiet scars as Radford's. Excessive force complaints that went nowhere. Testimonies from civilians that contradicted his reports. And most notably, a partnership history with Radford that stretched back over a decade. Imani scanned the timeline and saw the overlap clearly. The patterns weren't just similar, they were synchronized. Where one appeared, the other wasn't far behind. Her chest tightened as she realized that taking down Radford might have only exposed the edge of something much wider. She requested a meeting with Wells the next morning. He arrived on time, well-groomed, polite, eyes alert. She noted how calm he seemed, how at ease. A man who had grown accustomed to surviving scrutiny. He sat without being asked, leaned back slightly, and waited. "I want to talk about your time working with Officer Radford," she began. He smiled faintly. "Of course. Tragic situation." "I was shocked." "Were you?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. His smile faltered. "Absolutely. I mean, we had our differences. I can't say I knew everything about his methods. But I never saw anything criminal." Imani tapped her pen against the table once. "Then maybe you can explain why you signed off on 15 incident reports that are now under external review." He shifted slightly. "Everything I signed off on was based on the information I had at the time. If there were omissions, they weren't intentional." Her eyes didn't move from his. "You worked side by side with him for over 10 years. You reviewed reports, processed arrests, handled field responses together. You never once questioned his decisions." Wells exhaled slowly. "We trusted each other. That's what partners do." "No," she said, leaning forward now, "that's what silence does. And silence doesn't absolve you, Sergeant. It implicates you." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what it was like. Back then, things were different. The pressure on the streets, the expectations. You made calls in the moment, and you had to live with them." "I understand pressure," she replied. But I also understand integrity. And we don't get to rewrite our choices just because we regret them now. For the first time, Wells didn't answer. Imani let the silence hang, then finally said, "You're being placed on temporary administrative leave. Further investigation is pending." He stood without protest, nodded once, and walked out. But she knew from the look in his eyes that this wasn't the end. This was a test, not just of policy, but of courage. Because the deeper she dug, the more it became clear that justice required more than accountability. It required exposure. And exposure came with cost. That evening, she sat alone in the precinct conference room, reviewing data late into the night. She hadn't gone home in 2 days. Her apartment felt like a distant memory, a place she hadn't had time to feel safe in lately. Her work was here now, buried in folders, interviews, contradictions, and truths too long ignored. The retribution she had delivered was only a beginning, not a resolution. And with every file she read, every timeline she constructed, the more clearly she saw that reform wouldn't be enough. The department needed reconstruction. As she leaned back in her chair, exhausted but alert, her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Whitlow. He had sent her a photo, a simple image of him standing in front of a university campus building, backpack slung over his shoulder, smile small but real. The caption beneath it read, "I'm back. Thanks to you." She stared at the photo for a long time, a lump rising in her throat. That message didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the scars or rewrite the years he lost. But it mattered. It mattered in a way no headline ever could. Because it was proof that one action, when done with purpose, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. But that ripple had to continue. Imani's mind returned to a dilemma she had been avoiding, a public statement. There had been requests from the media, from civil rights groups, even internal pressure from the mayor's office. Everyone wanted her to go public. To put a face to the movement. To address the public not just as deputy chief, but as a symbol. But she feared something deeper, the weaponization of her presence, the performative optics, the exploitation of justice as a PR win. She knew that if she spoke, it couldn't be for comfort. It had to be for truth. Unpolished. Unapologetic. And irreversible. She drafted the outline of her statement that night, long after most of the city had gone to sleep. Not from a place of vengeance, but from necessity. The truth had to be spoken. Not whispered behind doors, not filtered through press releases. But plainly. Like every story she'd uncovered. Like every voice that had waited too long to be heard. Her final paragraph was still blank. Because she knew the ending wasn't hers to write alone. It would depend on what the department did next. On who stood beside her when the cameras rolled. On who chose to step forward rather than remain silent. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The reckoning had already begun. And the final blow was still to come. The press conference was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. The timing was strategic, late enough in the week that it would dominate weekend news cycles, early enough that the department couldn't be accused of hiding from the spotlight. The city of Baltimore buzzed with anticipation, the air charged with the same kind of tension that came before a storm. In the hours leading up to the event, news vans began lining the street outside the precinct. Community leaders arrived early, some standing in quiet groups, others speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Activists, journalists, survivors of misconduct, they all came, not for spectacle, but because they needed to see what would be said. And more importantly, what would be done after the cameras were off. Inside, Imani stood at the back of the small stage they'd set up in the department's public assembly hall, eyes closed, steadying her breath. The podium in front of her felt more like a witness stand than a platform. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to lay bare a truth that too many had ignored, denied, or rewritten. Her assistant stood quietly to the side, holding the final print of her speech. Imani didn't need it. She had memorized every word, not by force, but because every syllable came from lived experience, from the weight of silence she'd carried through too many rooms, through too many years. As the room filled, she saw familiar faces. Officers who had once looked past her, now watching her with something that resembled respect. Others who still looked uncomfortable, unsure where to stand, unsure what they would be implicated in once the truth began to unfold. And in the third row, to the left, sat Marcus Whitlow with his mother beside him. She gripped his hand tightly, eyes locked on Imani with a kind of gratitude that transcended language. The moment she stepped up to the microphone, the room fell into complete silence. Cameras clicked softly. Pens hovered over notepads. Everyone waited. She began slowly, her voice even but full. For far too long, this department has been defined not by the good it was capable of, but by the rot it refused to confront. The badge we wear is supposed to symbolize protection, service, and integrity. But what happens when that badge is used to silence the very people it was meant to defend? The room didn't move. Imani continued. Over the past several weeks, we have uncovered a pattern of behavior, not isolated, not accidental, that reveals how certain officers, shielded by silence and institutional complacency, abuse their authority. These actions have cost lives, dignity, and trust. They have created wounds in our communities that will not heal easily. But today, we begin a process of truth. And truth does not apologize. There was no applause. No one dared to interrupt the rhythm of her words. She paused briefly, then said the name aloud. Cole Radford is no longer a police officer. His badge has been revoked. His actions are under criminal review, not because we needed a scapegoat, but because accountability demands it. She scanned the room, made eye contact with no one in particular and yet everyone at once. But let me be clear. This is not about one man. This is about a culture. A system that allowed someone like him to rise unchecked. That is what must be dismantled. She outlined the reform policies now in effect: mandatory external reviews of all excessive force cases, mandatory de-escalation training, the creation of an independent civilian oversight board, and the reopening of 34 dormant complaints. Then, lowering her tone, she leaned slightly into the microphone. This department does not belong to those who fear progress. It belongs to the people we serve. And we will serve them better. Not because we want praise, but because we owe them our honesty. As she finished, the silence broke not with claps, but with the slow sound of chairs shifting, people standing, nodding, whispering. Some cried. Marcus remained seated, tears streaking his face, his mother gripping his shoulder. Imani stepped away from the podium, refusing interviews, walking directly toward them. As she reached them, Marcus stood and, without hesitation, wrapped his arms around her. They didn't speak. There was no need. Later that night, the building was quieter than usual. Most staff had gone home. Imani sat in her office staring at the whiteboard covered with cases and notes. She was exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually. A weariness lived deep in her chest, one that couldn't be eased by sleep or silence. The press conference was done, but the work was not. She knew the backlash would come. From within. From outside. She would be called divisive, political, too emotional, not impartial. But she didn't fear any of it. A knock at the door broke the quiet. It was Officer Carla Morrison, a young black patrol officer who had only been on the force for 3 years. Her eyes were wide, hesitant. "I just wanted to say," she started, voice shaking, "what you did today. I never thought I'd see something like that in this building." Imani motioned for her to come in. Carla did. "My father was arrested when I was 8, she said, sitting across from her. "He didn't do anything. They just said he looked like someone they were looking for. He missed a week of work. Lost his job. I wanted to be a cop to make sure stuff like that didn't happen to other people. But since I've been here, I've started to forget why I even joined. Until now." Imani listened quietly, then replied. You don't need to carry this alone, Carla. We do this together. That's the only way it lasts. Carla nodded, wiping her eyes. That's why I'm staying. That simple statement settled in the room like a promise. Over the next week, the department began its reckoning in earnest. Officers once protected by tenure or silence found themselves under review. Training rooms were filled not with lectures but with dialogue, hard, uncomfortable conversations that challenged deeply held beliefs. Some officers resisted. Others left. But many stayed. And some even stepped forward with their own stories, their own regrets, ready to be part of something different. One afternoon, Imani walked through the archives department, combing through decades-old files with a team of analysts. She had made it her mission to understand the full scope of the culture she was dismantling. Every redacted line, every missing form, every signature on a falsified document was a thread in the tapestry of injustice she now pulled apart. In the back corner of the room, a file drawer long jammed shut finally gave way. Inside were documents that predated even Radford, reports that implicated former captains, now retired, in covering up incidents eerily similar to the one she had just exposed. She realized then that what she had unearthed wasn't a singular scandal. It was a generational rot. And that knowledge came with a dilemma. How far back did she dig? At what point did exposure begin to damage the very institution she had vowed to heal? That night, she sat alone once more in her office. The city outside her window was quiet, unaware of the decision she now wrestled with. Transparency had brought justice. But too much too fast could erode the fragile trust she had just begun to build. Would the public demand every name? Every story? Would that bring healing, or chaos? She reached for her phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her mother. The voice on the other end was warm, steady, instantly familiar. I just needed to hear you, Imani said. Her mother paused, then asked, Are you safe? I'm more than safe. I'm seen, she answered. But I'm also standing on the edge of something bigger than I thought. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then said, You don't tear down a house to hurt the people inside it. You tear it down because it's been making them sick for years. And then you build something better. Imani closed her eyes, breathing in that truth. And when she opened them, she knew what the final step would be. The following week unfolded like a slow earthquake beneath the department's foundation. Every hallway, every office, every shared glance carried the tension of uncertainty, not just about the future of the precinct, but about the reckoning that was still unfolding from within. Imani knew she had stepped into a deeper battle than she'd anticipated. It wasn't just about cleaning up misconduct or correcting protocol. It was about confronting a culture that had been built on avoidance and polished silence. And now that the silence was breaking, the sound of truth was deafening. She had made her decision, she wouldn't stop at Radford or Wells. She wouldn't stop at the policies that protected them. She would dig as far as the rot ran. And that meant unearthing the names that had never made it to news cycles, the stories that had been silenced before they could be told, and the officers who had long since retired, their legacies untouched, yet their fingerprints on generations of injustice. She called an emergency executive session with the top brass of the department and the city's internal legal review board. It was held late in the evening to avoid attention, but the atmosphere in the room was electric with anticipation. They all knew what was coming. Some sat upright, ready to defend the system they had served. Others avoided her gaze. A few, to her surprise, sat quietly and listened with genuine attention. Imani stood before them with a file thicker than any she had presented before, each tab a decade, each name a ghost finally being pulled into the light. She spoke without dramatic flourish, without fury, but with a clarity that cut through every pretense. She listed incidents spanning 25 years, overlapping names, suppressed complaints, whistleblowers who were transferred or discredited, and the officers who had risen through the ranks despite the smoke that always followed their promotions. She presented photographic evidence of falsified reports, audio inconsistencies from archived interviews, and community testimonies that had never been taken seriously until now. The room remained still when she finished, the air thick with disbelief and shame. Finally, one of the deputy commissioners, a man who had been part of the system for 30 years, leaned forward and asked the question that had been brewing beneath all the tension. "So what do you want to do with this?" Imani didn't pause. "I want it public," she said, steady and unwavering. "All of it. Every name. Every case. Every lie we let stand. The community deserves to know who we've been. Not just who we say we're trying to become." There was a long silence, broken only by the quiet shifting of papers. "You realize what this will do to the city's trust in law enforcement," another officer said carefully. "Trust built on silence isn't trust," Imani answered. "It's fear. And fear is what brought us here." The legal advisor adjusted his glasses, tension in his brow. "Legally, some of these cases are past statute. Some of these people are dead. The department could face lawsuits. The city will be under scrutiny like never before." Imani nodded. "Then let it come. We've hidden behind technicalities for too long. It's time for honesty. Even if it costs us." After the meeting, as people filtered out of the room, one of the captains approached her. He was older, one of the few who had remained neutral throughout the process. "You're going to change everything," he said softly. Imani looked him in the eye and replied, "Not alone." He nodded and walked away. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room, surrounded by folders and photographs that had become more familiar than her own family. She thought about every person whose story was represented in those files. People who had gone unheard, who had learned the hard way that some truths were too inconvenient for institutions to carry. And yet, here they were now, no longer forgotten, no longer just footnotes in a corrupt ledger. Imani thought of Marcus again. Of his mother. Of Carla. Of the officers who had come to her quietly in the weeks following Radford's dismissal, confessing things they had kept buried for years. She remembered the rookie officer who had cried in her office, saying she didn't want to become like the people she was starting to emulate. Every story added weight to Imani's spine, but it also gave her strength. She was tired, but her purpose had never been clearer. The next morning, she called a department-wide assembly. It was held in the largest meeting hall they had, every officer present, uniformed, plain-clothed, command staff and patrol alike. The room was packed, the hum of quiet tension heavy in the air. Imani stood on the stage alone, no papers, no presentation, just her and her voice. "I know this has been one of the most difficult seasons our department has faced," she began. "I know some of you are angry. Some of you are scared. And some of you are wondering why we couldn't just move forward without reopening old wounds." She looked out into the crowd, scanning their faces, familiar, uncertain, waiting. But the truth is, those wounds never healed. They were covered. Hidden. Buried beneath layers of procedure and denial. And now that we've exposed them, we have a choice. We can continue pretending the infection isn't there. Or we can clean it out and start over. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to challenge you. To ask what kind of legacy we want to leave behind. Because we don't serve the past, we serve the present. And the present demands truth." From the back of the room, a hand raised. It was Officer Carla Morrison. "When you say you want to make it public," she said, voice strong, "what does that mean for those of us who've tried to do the right thing all along?" Imani met her gaze. "It means you're part of the new foundation. And your voice matters now more than ever." Another hand raised, a sergeant from a unit that had once worked under Radford. "People out there already think the worst of us. How do we fix that?" Imani stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "By owning the truth before it's used against us. By becoming the kind of department that doesn't run from its past but rebuilds in spite of it. The room was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't paralyzed. It was listening. Processing. Choosing. After the assembly, officers lingered longer than usual. Some approached her to ask questions. Others didn't say anything but gave a nod, subtle but meaningful. One older officer, quiet for most of his career, handed her a folder from his locker, a complaint he had buried years ago because he didn't think it would make a difference. "It does now," he said simply. Imani walked back to her office carrying more than just paperwork. She carried momentum. She called a press conference for the following week. But this one wouldn't be about policy updates. This one would be about the files. About the names. About everything the department had kept hidden. The city would know. The families would know. And what they chose to do with that truth, forgiveness, outrage, activism, would be their choice. But for once, it wouldn't be denied. She sat at her desk late that evening, drafting the report for public release. Each name she typed, each case summary, was like lighting a candle in a long dark room. And when she reached the final entry, she paused. Not because she doubted. But because she knew that when the world saw this list, there would be no going back. She clicked save, sent the report to legal for final clearance, and leaned back. The clock ticked quietly on the wall. Change had arrived. And it had a name. Justice not made for cameras. Justice not filtered for comfort. Justice that cost something. And Imani was willing to pay every cent. The day the full report was released to the public, the city of Baltimore held its breath. Local news outlets interrupted programming to break the story. Community centers filled with people crowding around small screens, waiting to hear the names. Some held hands, others paced, others simply stood silent. It wasn't just about the individuals listed in that document, it was about a collective reckoning, an acknowledgement that the pain they had carried for years was not imagined, not isolated, not forgotten. It was real. It had names. And it was finally being named. Imani stood behind a podium, but this time, she didn't speak from prepared notes. She didn't read from a script or a carefully worded statement approved by legal. She spoke from memory. From soul. From a place of purpose that had been sharpened by every injustice she had faced and every voice she had fought to amplify. She spoke the names clearly, without hesitation. She shared case summaries with precision and humanity. She didn't demonize. She didn't dramatize. She honored the truth and let it do the work it had been denied for decades. And when it was over, she stepped down without applause, without celebration, because the work was not meant to entertain. It was meant to restore. The city's response was swift, complex, and deeply human. Some families wept openly as they read the reports confirming what they had always known. Some picketed for further investigation. Others lit candles and gathered in quiet vigils, not out of anger, but relief, that someone had finally dared to speak aloud what they had been screaming into the void for years. And through it all, Imani remained grounded. She didn't chase headlines. She declined interviews. She returned to her office, continued the audits, answered calls from community leaders, and set up private meetings with families whose stories had been unearthed. She did not offer empty apologies. She offered transparency. And in doing so, she became something the department had never truly seen, a leader whose power came not from fear, but from earned trust. As for Radford, the aftermath of his exposure was swift and brutal. Stripped of his badge, his pension revoked, and now facing criminal charges, he vanished from public life. A former officer, once confident in his untouchability, now sat behind closed doors, waiting for the court dates that would determine whether his past would finally be held accountable in a court of law. His allies, once loud, fell silent. The same network that had protected him slowly unraveled, its members distancing themselves, choosing self-preservation over solidarity. The community that had once feared him no longer looked over their shoulders. He was no longer a symbol of authority, he was a cautionary tale. Sergeant Timothy Wells resigned quietly 2 weeks after the report was published. He submitted his letter with no protest, no defense, and no public explanation. But in the letter he left for Imani, one that never made it to the press, he admitted that his silence had been cowardice. He confessed to seeing more than he wanted to remember. And in that handwritten note, he asked only one thing, that she not stop. That she not let the fear of backlash keep her from finishing what she started. She never responded. She didn't need to. The work itself was her answer. Officer Carla Morrison, inspired by what she had witnessed, applied to join the department's new reform committee. She was accepted unanimously and began leading peer workshops on bias recognition, community trust, and integrity in the field. For the first time in her short career, she didn't feel like she was surviving in silence, she felt like she was building something. And her presence gave younger officers hope. Not just because she was outspoken, but because she had lived through the broken system and chose not to leave it, but to fix it from within. Marcus Whitlow graduated with honors a year later. He sent Imani a photo of him in his cap and gown, standing beside his mother. Attached to the email was a single sentence, "Because you listened, I kept going." He now volunteers with a youth justice organization, working directly with boys who've experienced trauma at the hands of the system. His voice, once muted by fear, now carries weight in every room he enters. And Imani, she was offered a promotion to chief of police. She declined. She chose instead to create an independent oversight initiative in partnership with local universities, legal advocates, and community organizations. It was the first of its kind in the city, a bridge between the system and the people it had long ignored. Her work was no longer confined to a single building or department. Her reach now extended into schools, neighborhood councils, state panels. She didn't just change the culture. She redefined what leadership looked like. And she did it not by commanding with intimidation, but by showing what accountability and compassion looked like when held together. She often visited the community centers in her free time. No cameras, no media. Just her and the people. She listened to stories, not as a figure of authority, but as a woman who had once been dismissed, once been humiliated, once been told she didn't belong. She knew that belonging didn't come from titles, it came from proving that you would stand, even when it cost you. The city changed. Slowly. Imperfectly. But visibly. And though not every wound was healed, and not every heart was mended, something undeniable had taken root. A belief that accountability was not impossible. That truth, when spoken clearly and boldly, could build something stronger than silence ever could. And now, to you, who've walked this journey with us, what are you taking away? Because maybe, like Imani, you've been underestimated. Maybe you've been silenced, judged, profiled, or pushed aside for daring to speak up. Or maybe you've been on the other side, a bystander, a witness, someone who didn't act when they should have. Either way, this story wasn't just about one woman or one man. It was about a system. About how people, when they choose to face truth rather than hide from it, can change everything. What would you have done in Imani's place? What silence are you still keeping? And more importantly, what are you going to do with what you now know? If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, or if it lit even a small fire inside you, don't let it fade. Leave us a comment. Share your thoughts. Let your voice join the ones that can no longer be ignored. And if you want more stories like this, of courage, justice, and shocking twists, subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit the like button so we can keep bringing you stories that matter. Because truth isn't just told, it's lived. And sometimes, it starts with just one person refusing to stay quiet.